Stephen King is one of the most renowned authors of the modern age. His entire back catalogue now includes over 80 novels, 200 short stories, 23 novellas, at least 5 non-fiction books, and several screenplays, 2 of which he maintains to this day he does not remember writing. In one interview, his output was compared to the score of a professional basketball game. To see if his remarkable success is linked to his disciplined writing process, and spoiler alert, it is, I decided to adopt his daily routine for a week, just to see what difference it made. But first, let's look at King's thoughts on writing itself. To start, Maine's most famous son suggests there are 2 types of writers. One group he labels as the plotters. They are the writers that know their characters intimately, right down to their desires, their goals, their backstories, and even their darkest secrets. Plotters tend to do all of their research beforehand and have the plot well and truly mapped out in advance. Then there's the pantsters, writers who literally fly by the seat of their pants. These authors write purely on instinct. Their stories often improve as events unfold, or they change dramatically as they go. In short, they tend to figure things out as they go along. Stephen King proudly puts himself in the pantsters category. He often starts with just one scene in his head, or even just a specific scenario. He lets the story expand naturally, instinctively, and spontaneously. For instance, I'm currently reading the 50th anniversary edition of Salem's Lot. I've read previous editions, absorbed at least one audio version, and I've devoured, no pun intended, both the original miniseries and the 2024 film. It's safe to say it's a favourite. When King originally started writing it, he had in his mind that this was going to be a narrative that went against the grain. He was thinking that he wanted the scenario to be the opposite of Dracula. In short, the good guys would lose and everybody at the end would become a vampire. But that's not what happened as he wrote. He went where the book led him, which even he admits was to a very dark place he didn't really want to go. I personally don't fit into either category completely. I do often start out with a rough outline for the story. I put in a lot of research beforehand, especially when it comes to specialist subjects outside of my field of knowledge. For instance, weaponry, that sort of stuff. I also have a pretty good idea of who my characters are and their background. However, I don't have the chapters mapped out in microscopic detail. In fact, I often only use a few sentences to peg down each one. And more often than not, I add new chapters as I go, or I change things up quite differently once I start writing. To use the popular military adage, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Not that writing is the enemy, although I'm sure there are days a lot of us independents feel that way. For example, in my own writing, when I first profiled Nina Lee, my protagonist in Rogue, she was quite stereotypically feminine, almost girly. This is a trope many male authors fall into when writing female characters, but that's a topic for another time. But in my notes, she liked horses, she had a bedroom that was probably a bit childish, maybe even naive. As I started to write her very quickly, it became clear that that wasn't who Nina was. She was strong, she was independent, and smart. Truman Capote perhaps put it best when he said, "You can't blame a writer for what the characters say." So, although I often have a good idea of where I want the story to go and who I'm working with, I work out a lot of the details along the way. You may well do the same. I'll give my thoughts on the effectiveness of the routines, how different writers work, and why pigeonholing or methodology might not be the be-all and end-all at the end of the video. So, on to King's typical daily routine. Let's start with what happens before he sits down at the desk. King insists on taking a regular daily walk before he starts writing. In interviews, the length has varied from 3 kilometres to 5. I chose 5 as the canal path that goes along the river near where I live is very conveniently 2.5 kilometres each way. I can also do a loop trail that is slightly longer if I don't want to retrace my steps. This definitely helped clear my head of the day-to-day stresses, the random thoughts that can lead to sort of procrastination, those sort of things. I found it much easier to sit down and get started once I got back from my walk. Here are some of the thoughts from those walks during the week. Be warned, an occasionally sweaty, overweight man will now appear on your screens. Viewer discretion is advised. So here I am on my first author's walk. Apparently every morning Stephen King takes a 5-kilometre walk before he starts anything else. I've always been a bit of a walker anyway, but I've always practiced savers, which includes a 30-minute exercise and morning walk. But today I'm setting out on a lovely 5-kilometre stretch of river near where I live, which is conveniently 2.5 kilometres each way. So we'll see how the week goes and how it contributes to my writing. So on my third author walk of the week, it's been a really interesting experiment so far. I definitely think getting home and just being able to crack on with some writing, I do feel a bit more energised, feel a bit more clear-headed. It's been kind of useful in that way. The only thing I have noticed, which probably says more about my fitness than anything else, is that by about 4 o'clock I'm a little tired, but I've definitely been able to go for longer in terms of the writing and get a higher word count during the day. So yeah, it's been really interesting so far. So day 4 of my author walks. You can probably hear, or hopefully hear, skylarks in the background there. I think one of the things that's been really interesting is obviously most of my books are wildlife based, and actually doing this morning author walk and immersing myself into sort of the territories and other aspects of the local wildlife. You know, for instance, I've really gotten to know the territory of the local buzzard pet and how they patrol that and when. So it's been really interesting, sort of reflecting on those aspects, and then writing 2,000 words of wildlife based horror. But obviously, it really grounds me with that in mind. So yeah, I find it really helpful. Another key part of King's writing routine before he starts is revisiting the last pages he has written and is happy with. In various interviews, King says this is at least the last 2 pages, but it can be up to 5 or 6. This gets him in the zone and rekindles his creative juices. He describes it as giving him a runway he can take off from before he starts writing. King also writes until he reaches his goal of completing 6 pages, or around 2,000 words. Not a block of time limited by hours, but by output. In this way, King, who tends to write every day, including his birthday and weekends, can produce a manuscript of 180,000 words in just 3 months. This sits within the average length of his novels, but it famously clocks in at over 440,000 words. The Stand is over 470,000 words. Even so, these epics would have been completed in just over 7 months working to this schedule. King, of course, has produced shorter works too. Carrie, his first novel, is just over 60,000 words. Misery, on the other hand, clocks in at just under 115,000, similar to my own stories. I know there are writers who produce significantly more. Brandon Sanderson, the prolific fantasy writer, has over 70 works to his name and famously typed 19,000 words in one day to finish the first draft he was working on. But fantasy writers are their own breed. I am a big Fourth Wing and Rebecca Yarros fan, and she's been posting on her Instagram recently of daily word counts between 7 and 9,000. However, King's routine is about consistency. Sanderson more typically writes 3,000 to 5,000 words a day, and Yarros recently acknowledged the need to slow down and have a break from writing. In contrast, King sticks to his 2,000 words a day and is relatively strict about having a 6 weeks period in between books and drafts just to reset his head. King feels very strongly that if he doesn't write every day, the characters begin to stale and mellow in his mind. He needs that constant freshness and re-emergence for consistency. Whilst an idea is fresh and exciting, he commits to getting that first draft down as quickly as possible. In his book On Writing, King explains how in the 80s he had quite a dramatic power desk, but now he works quietly in an attic, free of distractions, from a simple desk facing a wall. There's no phone in the room, no internet, just a glass of water and a cup of tea to keep him hydrated. As you can probably see behind me, I do not have that setup, and I have windows on both sides. I do, though, rely quite heavily on the glass of water and a good few cups of tea to keep me going. And I do use one of King's techniques to get and stay in the zone. I listen to music. King favours rock and metal, and there are various playlists of his favourite songs available on the different platforms like Spotify, Amazon Music and so on. I share many of his tastes, including AC/DC, Metallica and Bruce Springsteen. Whilst following King's routine, I did listen to this as much as possible, but my own preference when writing is actually classical music or atmospheric film scores. I really like the film scores. It also should be said, King has changed his routine to suit where he's now at. Whereas he used to listen to music as he wrote, he now favours writing in silence and then listening to music as he edits. I might not be the only one, based on some of his more recent work, who might want him to go back to listening as he writes. Something that King does that varies from my typical routine is that he edits what he's written that day, aiming to get a clean version down so he can start fresh the next day. That's something I usually leave until I finish the chapter I'm working on. When I started to edit on the day, I found that it was easier to keep the momentum going when I started the next morning, and that I wasn't spending time trying to remind myself what a character perhaps thought or said, those kind of things. Instead, I had a clear and grounded starting point, that runway King described earlier. Another of King's core beliefs is that you can't wait around for inspiration, as it may never come. In fact, I think he once said amateurs wait around for inspiration whilst the rest of us just get to work. Perhaps a little harsh, but I think we know what he's saying. I think this is really important though. It's something to grasp because I think a lot of people think they need to go on a writing retreat or disappear to a remote cabin, when really you don't need to do anything other than sit down at your desk and do the work. That's all it is. Or, to quote another favourite author, Ernest Hemingway, writing is easy. All you have to do is sit down at the typewriter and bleed. Other advice King offers from his long-term routine is to give yourself that 6-week break when you finish your first draft. He describes this as letting the story marinate a little bit. That way, when you return to it, the glaring holes in the plot and the character flaws are hopefully that little bit more obvious. He feels, and I think I agree, that you can't see them when you're close to the story just after finishing. I am going to try this when I get to the end of my current work in progress, and I'll let you know how it all works out. So, what did following Stephen King's writing routine for just under a week to date help me achieve? First of all, very clearly, my word counts greatly increased. Before I started, my current work in progress was sitting at just over 38,000 words. As of today, it's at over 50,000, and I'll easily surpass my goal of hitting 52,000 words this week. That puts me at roughly halfway through the story, which is great progress. In short, I basically wrote more than 10% of the book inside of a week. Secondly, I was much happier with what I wrote, and I felt much more immersed and connected to my own story. The daily editing did help keep the story fresh and alive for me, much more than I actually expected. I honestly believe this, alongside reading the previous day's pages, was pivotal to being able to consistently write those 2,000 words a day, as I wasn't wasting time trying to recall things or consulting notes before I got started. As for the daily walk, I also found this really beneficial. It reset my system and cleared my mind, and it also did a pretty good job of waking me up. It got my blood pumping and meant I wasn't dreary-eyed and still half asleep when I sat down to write. There was also clear mental health and general benefits to taking the daily walk. I felt better and calmer in myself, and as you saw, for me, as somebody who writes about animals and wildlife horror, that immersion into daily dips of the animal behaviour and interactions I saw whilst out on the walk really helped centre me and prompted me to think about the behaviour and instincts and how they react to our world. Finally, as someone who already uses music to stay focused, I can heartily recommend this. I find it really useful to block out distractions. And although I do have Wi-Fi turned on for streaming the music and for researching, I do usually have the phone on a stand a little away from me, so it's not in my field of view. Undoubtedly, Stephen King's routine has played a major role in his success. It shows significant discipline and dedication to the craft, and that's probably what we should all take away from this. Writing regularly for dedicated periods of time, or until you reach a goal of so many words, will of course see you write more. And as your mind is a muscle that needs exercising just as much as any other, that regular use and stretching will see your writing improve. I'm sure of it. But, and this is the important thing to remember, we're all different. And if there was a formula for writing a guaranteed bestseller, many more of us would be doing it. Most of us write because it's not just what we do, but who we are. Whilst this general outline of his routine is highly productive and, in my opinion, a really good template, nobody is saying it's the only way to do it. Does King walk 5 kilometres every day without fail? I'm not sure. I'd like to think he stays indoors in bad weather, taking a literal rain check. And remember, King is in a position to write every day and follow this routine now, which rather enviably also apparently includes relaxing after he's finished writing and editing by watching a movie or enjoying one of his pastimes. But before, like many of us now, he had to fit it around a career as a teacher or around his commitments as a father and husband. Ultimately, I'd encourage you to try it and see what works for you, as I did. But you don't need to follow it blindly or religiously if it doesn't fit. To close, I'll leave you with what Stephen King thinks is the best description of writing a novel by Thomas Williams. I have to admit, I couldn't find the exact quote, so I've coined it as best I can for effect and to get the message across. Writing a novel is akin to building a small fire on a dark, empty plain. One by one, characters begin to emerge from the darkness, bringing a little pile of wood to feed the fire. With luck, before the flames go out for good, you'll have had a bonfire that has warmed you through and brought light into your world whilst it lasted. My name is Luke Phillips, and I've self-published 4 novels with wildlife horror at their core. If you'd like to find out more about them, you'll find a link in the description. I'm also new to YouTube, so if you like what you've seen here, please like the video, subscribe, and I'd really appreciate it if you feel happy enough to share and spread the word. I'd really love to have your company as I explore writing as a self-published author, as well as the historic accounts of animal attacks, monsters, cryptids, and my own YouTube journey as I create content. Join me for another video very soon. Thank you very much for watching.